Hello, and welcome to my two-part video series on enlightenment. The material I'm going to cover in this video series is taken from my book, Evolving Towards the Truth, a guide for searchers of spiritual truth. The book consists of 3 meditations on God, the soul, and enlightenment. This video series is about enlightenment, or more specifically, Enlightened Realism, the term I use to describe my spiritual philosophy or my current set of beliefs. In this first video, I'm going to cover Enlightened Realism in general terms. In the second video, I'm going to cover it in more specific terms. In my book, I talk about 2 types of enlightenment, or 2 ways in which we tend to use the word today. The first type refers to the way it's used in Eastern religions, of becoming enlightened to discern or realize the existence of another plane of reality. Its premise is that we're basically too busy and too preoccupied with the stresses and concerns of everyday life to see the alleged truth about ourselves, our souls, our purpose, and the ultimate nature of reality. Attaining this type of enlightenment requires years of eyes-closed meditation, learning from revered gurus or masters, and solving mental puzzles or koans, such as, what is the sound of one hand clapping? In essence, this is a type of spiritual enlightenment in that it pertains to matters of life, death, purpose, and what allegedly happens after death. The second way we use the word enlightenment is as in the term Age of Enlightenment, referring to a period of time in Europe when man's knowledge of his universe basically exploded. This occurred during the 1600s and 1700s, and it refers to the time when people were asking questions, doing experiments, and generally challenging the accepted beliefs about everything from chemistry to biology to astronomy and philosophy. But more notably, underlying this activity was the idea that scientific truth was to be discovered not simply by accepting the words of the elders and the authorities of yesterday, but by doing experiments and challenging those earlier ideas. Enlightened Realism is basically a hybrid of these 2 types of enlightenment. It pertains to spiritual questions, as it does in the Eastern sense, but it takes an open-minded, rational, skeptical questioning approach, as it did in the European or Western sense. And to clarify, by spiritual questions, I mean those that pertain to life, death, meaning, and purpose. Whether there's a God, whether there's life after death, whether there's some higher plane of reality, and if there is a God, and if there is life after death, how should we live our lives? So Enlightened Realism is a hybrid. It takes a rational, open-minded questioning approach to spiritual questions. Just like the early scientists and experimenters of the Age of Enlightenment weren't afraid to ask questions and challenge the authorized, accepted versions of the stories that pertain to natural phenomena, Enlightened Realism applies the same genuine type of skepticism to questions pertaining to spiritual issues. There are 2 main contentions or tenets of Enlightened Realism. The first tenet is that there is much more evidence today in favor of a natural or naturally based spirituality than there is for a supernaturally based spirituality. In other words, as opposed to thousands of years ago, or even hundreds of years ago, there's no longer any justification for believing in a mystical basis for issues pertaining to life, death, God, and purpose. Because we know much more about our universe and ourselves than we did long ago, the need to rely on mystical explanations is no longer appropriate. Perhaps the best example of this is to do with explanations regarding Genesis, i.e. how the universe evolved, how our planet evolved, how life arose, and how Homo sapiens arose. Today there's far more evidence in favor of a natural genesis than there is for a supernatural genesis. As I discuss in the first 2 meditations of my book, an open-minded, rational searcher of spiritual truth will conclude that there's no justification for simply accepting the creation myths or creation theories of our ancestors, and much more justification for believing in a totally natural universe, a totally natural genesis of life, and a totally natural genesis and evolution of human beings. Granted, we still have much to learn, but today there's much greater reason to believe that life arose from natural processes and that it has continued to naturally evolve ever since than there is from many of the more popular creation theories of our ancestors. The second tenet of Enlightened Realism is that just as we've evolved physically and intellectually, we now need to evolve spiritually. As a species, we now need to mature and put away the childlike faith of our ancestors and move towards a more adult-like, realistic, reality-based spirituality. Our ancestors can be forgiven for simply accepting the myths and spiritual theories of their local shaman, their local medicine man, or their local religious authority. Back then, our knowledge of biology, physics, astronomy, and evolution was virtually non-existent. There were no other theories to explain how we got here or how this magnificent, awesome universe worked. Our ancestors can be forgiven for assuming that lightning and volcanoes were the acts of gods, that disease and dementia were the results of invisible demons, and that the planets and stars in the heavens were gods or spirits. Our ancestors basically had no other choices or alternatives. However, today things are much different. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Similarly, as we look out into the universe with our telescopes and instruments, we now realize that there's no need for mystical explanations. We also realize that we are no longer at the center of the solar system or the spiritual cosmos. We've been intellectually and spiritually humbled into acknowledging that it's very likely that life abounds throughout the universe. We're probably not as special as we once had reason to believe. So, just as we've evolved physically and intellectually, we now need to become more adult-like in our spiritual beliefs, our beliefs about life, death, and purpose. We need to accept a more realistic view of the universe and our place within this universe. We need to wean ourselves from these unfounded, unrealistic, and unbecoming myths of yore and adapt a more realistic, rationally based spirituality, based on the same mental tools that we use in every other aspect of our normal, natural, everyday lives. So, to summarize, an enlightened realist takes a more adult-like approach to questions of spirituality. Enlightened realism is based more on actual evidence than on revelation, based more on fact than wishful thinking or hearsay. When it comes to areas where claims of science challenge claims of religion, an enlightened realist is inclined and willing to admit that absence of evidence is very likely evidence of absence. In the next video, I'll cover more specifically what an enlightened realist believes. I believe enlightened realism is the closest thing we have today to actual spiritual truth, but I certainly don't claim that it's not open to challenge. I believe our ability to actually discern the truth will likely change as we continue to evolve and as we continue to learn more about ourselves and this universe. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this material is taken from my book, Evolving Towards the Truth, A Guide for Searchers. You can find more information about the book at my website, and you can purchase the book directly at Amazon.com. I'm Jeff Kosmosky. Thanks for watching.